I'd like to begin as usual with our land acknowledgement to remind us that Ottawa is built on unceded Algonquin and Anishinaabe territory. The peoples of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe Nation have lived on this territory for millennia, and we honor them and this land. Their culture and presence have nurtured and continue to nurture this land. CHEO also honors all First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people and their valuable past, present, and future contributions to this land. And now I'm delighted to present our presenters for this morning, all PGY3 pediatric residents, Catherine Baba, Geneviève de Caen, Eleni Levreault, and Tareen Mohamed. And I believe we will be starting off with Eleni. So Catherine, Geneviève, Eleni, and Tareen are pediatric residents with an interest in teaching and education. They enjoy working with children and learning through various styles and methods in their training. They have reflected how, during these times of COVID, the pandemic has impacted women in medicine, and through this Grand Rounds presentation would like to share their lessons learned relating to gender equity and advocacy. And I am in particular interested to hear what they're going to say. So the title of their presentation is Tales of the Shadow Pandemic, How Women in Medicine Have Been Impacted by COVID-19. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Eleni to lead us off.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Jabor. And I just want to make sure, can anyone hear me okay on the Zoom call? Amazing. So I just want to wish everyone a good morning. Thank you for joining us today for these Grand Rounds. We're very excited to present at a venue that we've been following since we were juniors, and in my case, since I was a medical student. So my name is Eleni, and I am joined today by my fellow R3s, Jen, Katie, and Tareen. And we're going to talk to you today about a topic that is very close to all of our hearts. And it may seem controversial to some, but we do continue to see and experience gender inequity in medicine. The ongoing pandemic has helped expose the areas in which the healthcare system and governments are deficient when it comes to supporting women and their families in times of need. And we hope you find this talk educational and feel equipped and inspired to lead changes to make your workplaces more equitable for everybody. We do want to begin again by acknowledging the land on which we are gathered today, which is the land of the Anishinaabe Algonquin people. And to them, they have inhabited and cared for these lands long before today. We take this time to show our gratitude and respect to them and to the land for all that it provides us. Trees to give shade, water and food to sustain us, and paths to connect us. Thank you. So I think everybody during the pandemic has created their own ways or found their own ways to cope with stress. And in my case, I found memes and humor was very helpful. So for those of you here who do have fur babies at home, I'm sure their faces were very similar to this doggos here when their humans had to stay home for longer than usual. So today, I hope to address the following objectives with my colleagues here. So one, we're going to look into the literature and describe what things look like for women in medicine pre-pandemic, because I think that is important to consider and then consider the ways in which the pandemic then affected women in medicine. The third objective is to discuss some lessons that we've learned, as well as describe and advocate for ways that we can argue for more equitable policies in the workplace. The crux for this talk is, looking at the literature, and of course, everyone has their own stories to share about their own experiences in medicine. The literature is not as broad as we had hoped on this topic, and we did our best to rely on strong scientific articles when possible to support the lessons learned. So a few disclaimers before we begin. We would just like to humbly acknowledge that we are not experts on this topic, and we have not actively researched ourselves or published in this area ourselves. As mentioned previously, there is limited research and some significant gaps in the literature remain. Much of the literature that we did find focuses on the experiences of cis women, and by no means do we intend to exclude the diversity of women that live on this earth, including trans women, femme, non-binary folks, and other folks who may not yet be represented in this body of work. And this presentation is truly not meant to single out any particular groups or to blame anybody, but truly to acknowledge and encourage knowledge, discussion, and advocacy regarding equity in the workplace. And of course, we can't talk about equity, especially not health equity, without recognizing intersectionality. And so I would like to share with you the words of the immortal Kimberly Crenshaw, who coined the term intersectionality in her essay in 1989. She wrote, "I would go on to learn that African-American women, like other women of color, like other socially marginalized people all over the world, were facing all kinds of dilemmas and challenges as a consequence of intersectionality, intersections of race and gender, of heterosexism, transphobia, xenophobia, ableism, and all of these social dynamics come together and create challenges that are sometimes quite unique. But in the same way that intersectionality raised our awareness to the way that Black women lived their lives, it also exposes the tragic circumstances under which African-American women die." And the reason I share such a poignant description of intersectionality is to highlight the degree to which the data we are about to present only scratches the surface of challenges that women from all walks of life face in their day-to-day lives. Not only does gender play a role in how a person is treated or compensated in their field, but how their gender interacts with the other social determinants of health can serve to further marginalize and disadvantage them. So I encourage everyone here today to keep their intersectionality glasses on for the presentation and consider these aspects when we're talking about the data that we're presenting. Without further ado, I cede the floor to Ms. Katie Baba.
Thank you, Eleni. So I'll now be walking through the gender gap in medicine that existed even before COVID. So females make up about 65% of Canadian medical students. And so it's obvious that we've closed the admission gap, but despite this, the gender gap in medicine continues to exist. Although women have outnumbered men in Canadian medical schools for a quarter of a century, women are not equally represented in leadership positions and are far less likely to reach higher ranks. This is even after controlling for age, experience, productivity, and specialty. Even though right now we're led by the fearless Dr. Catherine Smart, only 8 of the past 152 CMA presidents were women. Currently across Canada, only 4 out of 17 deans of medicine are female. This recent article published in the New England Journal of Medicine assessed rate of expected promotions of women and men. Women were initially actually 12% more likely to enter academic medicine. However, they're 25% less likely to be promoted to associate or full professor, and 54% less likely to be appointed to department chair. Unfortunately, looked across time from 1979 to 2011, and they actually found that the gender gap has only widened over time. In 2011, women were even less favored than men to be promoted to department chair compared to 1979. The question becomes, why are women underrepresented in leadership positions if the admissions gap has essentially closed? Ultimately, I think this answer is multifactorial. The intricacies are difficult to articulate and even more difficult to study. I'll now be highlighting a few key areas where the barriers are obvious as to why women have more difficulty climbing the ladder in medicine. It has long been known that women in STEM fields are published at lower rates than men. This recent study sought to explore how much of this phenomenon is based on proposed science versus the applicant themselves. The study used data from the Canadian Institute of Health Research, where a national experiment essentially was created. In 2014, 2 new streams of applications were created, one with a heavier emphasis on assessment of the applicant themselves rather than on the proposed science. To the left of this graphic, we have applicants that were assessed traditionally, which found that 0.9% more men were granted success compared to women. In the middle, researchers assessed proposals based on this project model. In this model, 25% of the assessment was based on the applicant themselves, including expertise, experience, and resources. This model was ultimately comparable to the traditional model and saw 0.9% difference in success. In the far right, we have the last foundation model, where assessors placed much greater weight on the applicant. when 3/4 of the weight is placed on a subjective score of leadership, productivity, and contributions, women were statistically significantly less likely to obtain grant success, with a gap of 4% compared to men. This last paper assessed clinicians early on in their career in research. This next paper assessed physicians across their career paths in Canada. On the bottom, we have past funding success rate. To the left, we have an overall score of the application. And this is also using CIHR grants. The dashed lines represent females and the black lines males. Researchers found that over time, not only did women fare worse than men, but that this gap only widened over the course of their career, and that men with clearly less prior success were scored higher than women with more expertise. The sexism and appraisal of women in research translates directly to less publications and less first authorship publications. This study published in the BMJ found that the gender gap for first authorship was steadily closing until 2010, at which point women have remained at only 40% of first authorship. And for many journals, this percentage has actually started to decline in recent years, even before COVID. With assessment of publications as a key factor for granted promotions in academic medicine, the sexism in research is a clear barrier to women advancing in their careers. Not only do women have to navigate societal constraints at work, but research shows time and time again that women bear more of the work at home, creating more difficulty to balance work and home demands. This holds true in partnered relationships, whether the couple have children or not. Married heterosexual female physicians with children spend on average 100 more minutes per day than their physician partner on childcare and household tasks. Accumulated over time, this represents over 12,000 hours over 20 years of raising children. And this translates to 6 years of full-time work that their partner is not having to do. Balancing a second full-time job during the pivotal foundational years of your career is another clear barrier to women advancing in medicine. The last topic I'd like to touch on may seem like an extreme, but it speaks to something that unfortunately every woman in this audience has likely faced. A culture so overt but tolerated that people think it is hidden, ultimately creating a workplace that can at times make women feel unsafe. And this topic is sexual harassment in medicine. This US study on sexual harassment of women in STEM was published in 2018, highlighting that women across STEM disciplines face sexual harassment. Greater than 50% of female faculty experience sexual harassment in academia. I'm sorry, for some reason the chart isn't showing, but this figure shows medical trainees. It showed medical trainees to the far right, and it showed that female medical trainees are 150% more likely to experience sexual harassment from faculty and preceptors than compared to other STEM fields. And while this presentation is about women in medicine, I would also like to highlight that this graphic also showed that male trainees in medicine are also far more likely to face sexual harassment than men in other STEM fields. This study shown for a Canadian study found that the most common perpetrator was actually patients, followed closely by peers. Faculty also accounted for a small number of perpetrators. And then just to touch on the slide that Eleni is currently on, out of over 800 cases, only 184 students discussed what happened with someone. The majority discussed it with a friend. Of the 24 discussed with a preceptor, only 6 were reported to official school authorities, and only 1 was reported to police and the regulatory authority for physicians. These numbers potentially highlight the culture of tolerance for sexual harassment in medicine, bearing in mind that the majority of cases were patient or peer-related. Of the 16 cases where staff was the perpetrator, it's unclear how many women decided to report. However, the fact that only 1 case went forward to the regulatory authority for physicians speaks to the silencing culture of sexual harassment. How do we expect women to close the gender gap in medicine when they may not feel safe at their workplace? How do we keep women safe and make them feel safe in medicine? Now that I've highlighted a few of the barriers women face to reach the glass ceiling, I wanted to speak to a separate phenomenon called the glass cliff. Research shows that even if women prevail through every obstacle and reach positions of leadership, that they're more scrutinized and more likely to fall from positions of authority than male counterparts. Further, research shows that even if women reach top leadership positions, the gender pay gap is a stark reminder that they are valued less than men. And so at this time, I'll hand things over to Dr. Tareen Mohamed to speak to that.
Thank you, Katie. So the question is, sorry, one second. Here we go. So is the pay gap real? So the gender pay gap is defined as the difference between what men and women earn for roughly equivalent work. There have actually been numerous studies, most of them from the United States and the UK, that have shown a clear gender pay gap among physicians. This effect is actually seen in all environments, including clinical, research, and academic. These inequities start at the early stages of a woman's medical career, deepen within time, continue into retirement, and actually affect the lifetime wealth. There's an estimation in these studies that as high as $2.5 million over 30 years is what is affected. This is adjusted for factors like age, specialty, number of hours worked, and practice characteristics. Although there's limited data available in Canada, the studies that have been done actually still suggest a similar situation. Recent Ontario analysis highlighted the gender pay gap within specialties. They noted that on average, male physicians earn 30% more and male specialties earn 40% more than their female counterparts. Bringing it to home, closer to home here in Ontario, this study was actually a cross-sectional analysis of all Ontario physicians who submitted claims to OHIP in 2017. They identified a total of 30,167 physicians who submitted claims. They compared the differences in physician claims between men and women within the entire cohort and then within each specialty. And they essentially used a multivariable linear regression, which controlled for the length of practice, the specialty, and the practice location. Looking at the graph here, essentially what it shows is it groups physicians by total annual claims. On a whole, more women were represented in the group of physicians claiming less than 300,000 annually, and more men were represented among physicians claiming 300,000 or more. And taking it here, since we are all in pediatrics, you can actually see, sadly, that this gap is significantly more disproportionate within the pediatric specialty itself. Furthermore, this study, specifically looking at numbers, showed that the mean additional fee for service payment a man claims compared to a woman in pediatrics is $86,000 more per year. On a whole, the results showed that women claim 74% of what men claim overall, and this accounts for rurality as well as years in practice. The difference in claims was present with almost every specialty and persisted in a sensitive analysis that accounted for missing payments from alternate payment plans in the primary data source. So then the question kind of comes in the literature, like, is it that women just work less or work less efficiently than men? The CMA 2019 National Physicians Survey, which included part-time and semi-retired physicians, showed that compared with men, women work 4.7% fewer hours per week and 8.6% fewer hours on call, which is actually a really small difference compared to the disparity outcome. Although women may have a temporary decrease in their work hours when having children, over the course of their careers, women as a group do not actually work substantially less than men. Taking a look at the root cause, it seems that the discrimination itself is rooted in the history of women's exclusion from the profession, along with the institutional legacies of sexism in medical schools, clinical care arrangements, healthcare organizations, and the fee system itself. One of the root causes that I'll highlight is that women continue to face subtle and often unconscious biases in recruitment and hiring. As Catherine already discussed, there are fewer women in medical leadership roles and higher academic rank. And because of this, men in leadership benefit from the higher income associated with the leadership and can also perpetuate the policies and informal support networks that recruit, retain, and promote other men at disproportionately higher rates. In the literature, it also shows that women are more likely to experience what we all know as imposter syndrome and have lower salary expectations compared to men. But in addition to this, they see themselves less capable of negotiating higher pay, which may be true because the studies show that women are more likely to experience consequences from actually trying to negotiate this higher pay. Another one of the root causes that I'll highlight is this referral bias, which is demonstrated in this 2017 study using US Medicare data. And this showed that female surgeons, for example, taking a look at that specialty, actually received fewer referrals from primary care physicians overall. And that if a patient had a poor outcome, that primary care physician was less likely to refer to any woman in that specialty. But on the flip side, if that poor outcome was by a male surgeon, an equivalent drop in referrals to men was not seen. As you can see, what was highlighted previous, there's already a gender gap that was present prior to 2019, and then came COVID. I'll pass it along to Dr. Genevieve Decan to speak about the impacts of COVID on the gender gap.
Thank you, Tareen. So as everyone in this kind of virtual room is aware, COVID came with a huge slew of social ramifications and workplace ramifications. And one of the big changes that many of our colleagues experienced was the effects that the shutdowns of schools, shutdowns of daycares, pulling back of a lot of these societal supports ended up playing in what we call increased duty in the second shift. And the second shift is a principle in gender equity science, which aims to describe that extra burden that a caregiver, woman or a man, experiences in that secondary full-time job that it is often taking care of, whether it's a child or an elderly parent or another dependent outside of your full-time work. And the fear that arose and some of the early data arising out of COVID prompted a concern within the scientific community that in correlation with this increase in the second shift, that we may start to see a loss in terms of the diversity in STEM, and specifically this secondary epidemic of loss of early career scientists across science, technology, engineering, mathematics, and medicine. Next slide, please. And while the data from this is limited, more so given that we don't have the big picture yet, early reports of preprints, so these are manuscripts that have been submitted, have gone through the peer review process, but have not yet reached electronic or paper kind of dissemination. If we look at the preprint data that was highlighted by Lamar et al. Out of Montreal, we do see that there was a significant drop off. I'm going to take a quick minute and orient everyone to the graph. So when you look at the graph here, what you're seeing on your y-axis is your percent of first authors who are women. So highlighting that this controls for the total number of publications, such that it is really the ratio of first authors that are women that we are tracking. And it is looking over time, pre-pandemic, from April 2019 into the first 6 weeks of the COVID-19 pandemic, April 2020. And depending on the academic sphere, what was the trend we saw in terms of those first authorships? And in terms of so I'll be honest, I wasn't sure about the preprint databases before looking into the literature myself, but just to orient everyone, if we look at the preprint databases, the BioRxiv, that is your biological sciences, geological sciences database, relatively constant. Your ARXIV, that's really your general academic database, relatively constant throughout the medical kind of the start of this pandemic. However, when we look specifically at health sciences, that's where we see a significant drop off in that percent of first authors that are women from pre-pandemic, which was only about 35% to 40%, again, not at an equitable place yet, to closer to 19%. And this, in part, has been attributed to what is hypothesized, that second shift that is placing that increased caregiver role on a classically gendered role in the home on women, and is impacting young career scientists' ability to then achieve academic productivity. Next slide, please. So in order to try and assess this a bit more robustly, Krakowski and All's group out of the United States aim to look more broadly at different markers of academic productivity and try to objectively describe what were the ramifications or the velocity that is described pre versus post-pandemic across STEM fields. And this is something that had to be done via a survey format, because again, we don't have the time or longitudinal data yet to be able to comment in terms of publication rates, but looking at self-reports of academic velocity. So specifically things such as submissions of manuscripts where you're the first author, or submissions of manuscripts where you're the senior author, sitting on a granting agency or a journal review board. Looking at those specific, objective, easily reportable markers, they surveyed across academics across STEM fields in the United States and looking at both childcare status, gender status, and socioeconomic status. What were the differences in academic velocity pre and post pandemic? Next slide, please. And interestingly, I'll ask Lenny, do you mind going to the next slide? Sorry about that. Interestingly, so when we look at gross academic productivity, so across all domains, we didn't see a significant gendered impact. So really it was the age of one's children, so having children under the age of 6, that had the most significant impact across all realms of academic productivity. However, when we look specifically at markers that are typically associated with early career trajectory, so first authorship paper submissions or co-author paper submissions, that's where we see a significant gendered effect. And with this, the question arises within the STEM community, is it actually the early career women that we're seeing are starting to feel the effect of that second shift? And are we going to really see the effects of this pandemic 10, 15 years from now, when we'd expect these women to be stepping into leadership roles? Next slide. Sorry, just I think having a bit of a slide malfunction. So if we take a step back and we look more broadly at the literature that is emerging around the experience of women throughout this healthcare crisis, there are other themes beyond the academic productivity that have emerged. So I just wanted to highlight this scoping review that was completed by Morgan et al. And really this was an interdisciplinary cross-country scoping review that looked at experiences of women in healthcare. So not just physicians, but nurses, physician assistants, RT, so on and so forth, and was really looking at what does the early data suggest in terms of general themes of experiences of women as they progress through this pandemic and other crises, and the secondary effects that a global pandemic has in terms of not only their careers, but their mental health. And one of the themes that had the most literature, and I think relates very strongly to many of the people at this talk today, was that one of the areas in which we saw the most kind of significant gendered effect was actually in terms of reports on mental health and how the COVID-19 pandemic has been associated, again, across disciplines and across the world with an increase in terms of mental health ramifications, anxiety, depression, stress for women in healthcare. Next slide. So if we take a step closer to home and we look at the North American context, there have been some early studies that, again, using survey methodology, have aimed to assess what are the mental health outcomes that we're seeing as a result of this COVID-19 pandemic. And highlighting the study by Frank et al., I think this was a really cool design, to be entirely honest, where effectively what they did was they had a cohort of interns, men and women, from 2008 that were involved in an original longitudinal study that aimed to assess mental health and anxiety, so anxiety and depression markers during one's intern year, and then comparing that kind of 10 years post and in 2018, so when you'd be in early career, early practice. So what this study did was they effectively stole that cohort and they actually were able to contact a good chunk of the initial participants and consent them to be involved in a subsequent follow-up study in 2020 with the start of the pandemic. And what this allowed for was to look specifically at the anxiety, depression, and work-life conflict parameters that were initially assessed in that 2008 to 2018 cohort, and to be able to look within that same population, what were the differences we were seeing early in this COVID-19 pandemic. Next slide, please. And if we look at some of the factors that they assessed, one of the key components that they highlighted in this 2020 follow-up survey was really trying to get a framework for what were the ramifications of this second shift for these young physicians in practice. And when they looked at key markers such as experience of childcare loss, experience of increased burden of responsibility at home, whether it's through taking on a teacher responsibility or increasing your caregiver responsibility. They noticed that this was significantly gendered. So we were seeing, well, it still was affecting young men who are parents. We were seeing an increased effect on young women in our specialty. And this was highlighted and felt very keenly because there was a significant increase in the number of women versus men who were the primary caregiver. So when we think back to the early pandemic with the school closures, what they were able to capture was that associated or correlated with this increase in the second shift, there was actually an increased proportion of women that were reporting what they described as a quote, voluntary reduction in their work hours, which is voluntary by the means that it was not imposed by their academic institution, but reflective of their familial requirements at that time. And next slide, please. And when they ultimately then asked that same cohort, so looking at the individuals within that cohort that were parents before the pandemic in 2018 and parents in early pandemic in 2020, and they looked specifically at markers of depression and anxiety using validated scales. So the PHQ-9 is a validated screening tool for depression. The GAD-7 is a validated screening tool for anxiety. They found a statistically significant difference in terms of reported symptoms of depression amongst women when compared to not only men during the COVID-19 pandemic, but also compared to their prior scores, reflecting that increased burden of symptomatology and burnout in young women in our specialty. Now, how this translates into a clinically significant difference, it's hard to say. Again, these scales are very general, and the sensitivity specificity really doesn't become robust until you get kind of to a score greater than 10. So how do we translate a score difference of 1.5 on a PHQ-9 is hard to say, but again, this is reflective of means. So we're not capturing the extremes of the bell curve and seeing truly the proportion of women that are having significant burnout, fatigue, and mental health concerns secondary to these effects. Next slide. So taking a bit of a step to a different lens, what Dillian et al.'s group tried to quantify was really that clinically significant outcome. So the reports of burnout. And this was based, again, a survey study based out of Northern California, and where they effectively surveyed physicians, nurse practitioners, physician assistants across specialties. So captured a good amount of family medicine physicians, internists, surgical subspecialties, and pediatrics, and surveyed physicians or healthcare workers, really cross age from typically around 29 into kind of the 60-year-old age bracket, and men and women. And what they aimed to assess was they completed effectively, had 5 areas of thematic analysis that they were trying to characterize pre versus post-pandemic amongst this population. And one of these areas was specific to burnout. Next slide, please. And interestingly, when they did the actual analysis in terms of burnout markers, so they had 6 questions that were specific to burnout, and it was a self-reported Likert scale, they found that, again, it was typically the individuals who are under the age of 55, so those who reported having more caregiver responsibilities for young children, for instance, who were the overall highest bracket for burnout, with women reporting an increased rate of around 2.19 women to every 1 man reporting high levels of burnout, again, related to that increased caregiver responsibility, concerns regarding career advancement, job security, and additional tasks related to the pandemic. But when they actually did the gendered analysis of the subsets based on age, the age group that most keenly was feeling the effects of severe burnout was, interestingly, not the women under the age of 35, but actually women in what they coined the sandwich generation, which was women typically between the age of 55 and 65, where they were still keenly feeling the caregiver effects of taking care of their children, who are typically in their kind of late teens, early 20s, but also the effects of that increased caregiver responsibility caring for elderly parents. And when they asked on open-ended question, what would be the pieces that would be beneficial in terms of mitigating this risk of burnout? it was consistent that caregiver support, both in terms of protected childcare, but also in terms of protected elder care, were highlighted as the key modifiable factors that physicians were reporting a desire to see changed in their academic institutions in order to help mitigate this risk of burnout. Next slide, please. So it really comes down to, when we think about what have we learned so far, recognizing we're only about 2 years into this. When we think about the key points, really, first and foremost, there is still this question as it relates to what does this mean for early career women? We know that early pandemic data suggests a decrease in academic velocity for women in medicine, and this correlates with the COVID-19 pandemic. We've seen that there are increased demands in this second shift, and it's been hypothesized that this may actually be responsible for that change in academic velocity. But really, it's the need for longitudinal data that's actually going to tell us what are the impacts that these factors will play into diversity metrics and representation at the upper echelons of leadership 10, 15 years from now, when we would expect these early career physicians to step into a leadership role. And with that, I'll hand the mic back to Dr. Levreault, who will tell us a little bit more about how we can advocate for gender equity in the workplace.
Thank you very much, Dr. Decan. So now what? So now we've heard things about how things were pre-pandemic, peri-pandemic. And so what next? What are things going to look like for the remainder of the pandemic and then in the future? That truly depends on the actions that we choose to take today and going forward at multiple different levels. So as previous slides have demonstrated, there remains significant gender-based inequities within medicine. Here, we will see a table showing a proposal for where we can act at different levels within different stakeholder groups and to work together to address gender inequities in the medical field. I want to particularly draw your attention to the far right column, where you will see ideas listed for individual physicians. Now, let's pretend that this box is not solely about the gender pay gap. I think that all of these particular suggestions are applicable for many of the different types of inequities we see in medicine. Specifically, we do need people that can act as role models by doing training, by training people, and by getting women in more marginalized communities and folks who are maybe not on the gender spectrum as we see it between male and female. Get more people in the field to train more people in the field. Advocate for open, advertised competitions with a transparent process. We did see a study that showed that in certain cases, one gender over the other is preferred for promotions and for leadership positions. Let's change that. Let's try to see what we can do by including everybody in the process and giving everybody not only an equal chance, but an equitable chance. We also do need to truly actively mentor and sponsor women. There's a lack of opportunities for mentorship in medicine. And a lot of folks, especially women who go into male-dominated subspecialties, oftentimes find themselves without someone to look up to and someone to show them the ropes and give them that wisdom. And a lot of the times they are left to fend for themselves. And that's not to say they are helpless by any means. That is not to say they can't do it by themselves. But sometimes it's exhausting and you don't need to do that. And there are ways that we can make that easier by having not only women or fellow gender non-binary folks mentoring them, but also having the men in the room step up and say, hey, I'm going to take you under my wing. Let me show you the ropes. Let me advocate for you. Using that privilege to help the next generation of women and gender non-binary folks in medicine. And the last is supporting women. Support women by sharing household labor more equitably. We've seen from the studies so far, and we're only 2 years into the pandemic, but that the disproportionate amount of household work and childcare does fall on the backs of women. And so we need to advocate not only as individuals, but also at the government level, the policy level, the legislation level, to get more help and more support so that not only women get the support, but families who have same-sex or same-gendered parents, people who are taking care of loved ones who are ill. We need that time, we need that space, we need to advocate for those policies very strongly. And so these are some other thoughts that the Ontario Network microsite has found and has found helpful. So ensuring equal pay, offering a pension plan, and top-ups for maternity and parental leave benefits, providing stable employment, investing in professional development opportunities, create safe reporting mechanisms for discrimination and harassment. Let's get rid of gendered roles and let's be accountable to have that gender parity and diversity in leadership. Some legislation that you can look at today and think about supporting would be things like paid sick leave. So making sure that everybody in Canada has access to 10 days of paid sick leave, plus another 5 to 7 in times of crisis, such as the pandemic, so that people can take their kids home from school, people can get their loved ones vaccinated, people don't have to worry about losing their jobs if they stay home, if they themselves are symptomatic. Let's work on funding childcare benefits. Let's work on making schools and daycares safe during pandemics and other crises. Let's make sure that these buildings are getting updated ventilation systems, that even if there are future pandemics, that we work to keep the kids in school and in daycare so that their development isn't impacted, their education and their health and mental health. Let's support our childhood educators. They are so crucial in helping our kids become functional and intelligent human beings in our communities. And we do need to help make sure that they are prioritized for things like vaccines and healthcare and do get the compensation they deserve for the work that they do. And the last thing I will advocate for, especially in light of the upcoming municipal elections here in Ottawa, are to vote, 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 vote. Vote in municipal elections, vote in provincial elections, and vote in the federal elections. It may seem sometimes that our vote is insignificant, but it is not. And it is your chance, especially as a privileged member of the community as a physician, to have your voice heard. And a lot of folks, if they don't like how things are run, they actually end up running themselves for leadership positions as well. So these are some things, very tangible things that you can support as an individual and help support this for your colleagues as well. So in summary, gender inequity in medicine remains prevalent. There's no question about that. These inequities are highlighted further in times of crisis, as seen with the COVID pandemic. A change in culture is needed and is not a destination, but rather a journey that is prone to redirection as new information comes in. And the change is within us. We need to model it and allow others to model it as well. I will end with a powerful image that the four of us found on Twitter the other day. So this is Stephanie Parks Taylor, who wrote, "My 8-year-old with the worksheet mic drop, hashtag the kids are all right." And you'll see 3 pictograms here of women of varying ages, or rather this is supposed to be implied by the captions and the photographs we see here. So we see one young lady jumping rope under the age of 18 named Sarah. We have a woman holding a poster saying she is unmarried or has an unknown marital status. And I don't know if you've ever seen this in the streets. I don't see this very often, but her name is Mary. So good for you, Mary. And then we have Laura, who I believe based on this image, we're supposed to infer she's married because she has a ring on her finger. So the question is Lara, so the last one on the right here, is she a Miss, a Ms, or a Mrs.? And this 8-year-old writes, "I think she is a doctor." Thank you very much for your time and attention. We will now open up the floor to questions, comments, and discussion. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you all. That was a really interesting presentation. You had so much varied data for us to think about and to reflect on. I think there's going to be a lot of discussion. I've noticed that we have a really broad range of participants at Grand Rounds today, including males and females within the hospital and beyond the hospital. So I think we might be up for a very interesting discussion. So we're going to start with Stasha Hadjianakis. Go ahead, Stasha.
Hi.
Oh, sorry, Stasha, before you start, maybe you can take the slides down, Eleni, so that we can see each other a little better. Thank you. Go ahead, Stasha.
Hi. Thank you very much for a great discussion, great presentation, sorry. And I'm looking forward to an interesting discussion. Just picking up on what Eleni was chatting about, just sort of thinking more broadly about just women in general traditionally being working in positions that are traditionally, I guess, more undervalued or underpaid, particularly sort of caregiving roles beyond sort of physician roles, nannies, childcare workers, food services workers. If for a minute during the pandemic, I thought maybe we had an opportunity to actually correct some of that. People were sort of lauded for being essential workers. We're getting some hazard pay even, but it quickly disappeared. The idea of sick leave pay also sort of came and went without much staying power. So I was just wondering, if we're thinking about improving the lives of all women, what do we think about how do we capitalize on some of the momentum that was present during the pandemic to make a more sustainable change for women and across sectors, I guess, and more broadly in medicine? What do you think we've missed the opportunity, or can we can we leverage some of what was being discussed during the pandemic?
I think that's an excellent question. And I'm an eternal optimist. I never think it's too late for anything. I think that we did have that momentum. I totally agree with you, Dr. H. And, there were people who tried to capitalize. Dr. Stillman, for example, she's a pediatrician out of Toronto. She worked with the Decent Health and Work network to help. She wrote some op-eds. I wrote one with Daniel Beerstone, who's a former resident here. I think there was that push initially, and then unfortunately, not to blame everything on the Conservatives, but it happens to be a Conservative government, didn't see that it was necessary and voted against it for, I think, the third time, if I'm not mistaken. I think it's been a couple of times. So that being said, I think what we need to do is what a lot of other groups have done, is band together and try to make ourselves vocal and visualize. We need to be seen. And so maybe that does require us going to the media and speaking about it openly. Maybe that does require more of us to write. I think truly it does mean most of us should be writing to our MPs, to our local politicians, and advocating, saying that this is important and that this is one way that you'll garner votes from our community, is to take these things seriously. Because I think that's one of the issues, is that people want to look like they're doing something by imposing restrictions and saying you need to get vaccinated and all these things. But then there's barriers that are not as sexy to talk about. And we do need to make those more known to people. So I think just having, instead of saying, oh, someone else will do it, someone who's a better writer, is a better speaker, I think we all just need to take that opportunity and just say, you know what, I need to speak up about this. I need to, maybe I'll share more on Instagram. Maybe I'll tweet about it more. Maybe I'll go to a local radio station and talk about it. Maybe I will write to my MP. Maybe I'll go on the news, who knows? But I think we do need to have maybe more of an organized approach. And I'm not sure if anyone in the room has experience doing something like that or other ideas, but I think we do have a collective, powerful voice that we can use, and it's never too late to use it.
Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you for that question, Stasha, and for your response, Eleni. I'm going to invite your co-presenters if they want to add anything to your very robust response.
I think Dr. Levreault did a great job there. I just wanted to comment as well that right now the government, they are apparently trying to push forward more for childcare. So there is a petition, which is an easy way just to add your name and provide support. So I'll just post within the chat as well. You're welcome to visit and sign if you're in agreement that childcare is very much needed.
Great. All right, everyone else is nodding in agreement. Tahreen, I don't know if you were trying to say something. You're muted. No, you weren't. Okay. And I see Katie just put in the chat there the details about childcare and the opportunity to sign this petition. Okay, thank you. Anyone else have any comments or questions? You can raise your hand or just start talking, raise your virtual or your physical hand. There's some very positive comments in the chat so far. One question that, I was thinking about, I'm very much, maybe like you, Eleni, very positive in focus and optimistic, sometimes to a fault, maybe. Really, you've highlighted a lot of the realities of, gender inequities that there's evidence for, and the issues of burnout in particular that have been accentuated by the pandemic. Thinking in a more proactive or positive focus, what would you say are the modifiable factors, to use the words I think Genevieve used in her part of the presentation? What are some of those modifiable factors that we can focus on, maybe not in the world, but in our community here within CHEO? What are some of those things that you think could make a difference? Yeah, it looks like Genevieve's ready to go.
No, I'm glad you asked that question, because I think that when you look at the literature, and this is pre-pandemic and post-pandemic, the literature around burnout, one of the main protective factors is being valued. And that piece around giving a voice to individuals who are experiencing a difference in equity, and then subsequently valuing those individuals for the work that they provide is huge. And one of the ways that, as I think a group that we can see value, is by seeing people like us in positions of leadership. And that gives voice not only to the concerns and the specific barriers that our population may feel, but then diversity at that decision-making table. And when we look to the business literature, which has honestly done a really good job at this. So there's a gray literature study that came out, I believe it was JP Morgan, which is an investment company, if I'm not mistaken. They looked at actually implementing a mentorship program within their institution that was aimed to try and improve retention of women kind of beyond the lower management level, because they were seeing a huge exodus of women before they reached senior management, and to then improve career advancement for these women within their company. And they implemented something called the 35 1-minute program. And this is something that I think is tangible for women and men in leadership positions, where what they asked was 36 minutes a week, say probably even every 2 weeks, where it was 30 minutes sitting down, having a coffee with someone who was underrepresented in their institution. They focused on women and women of color. So have a coffee with them, get to know them as a person, 5 minutes, talking them up to them, reminding them that they have value, which we know is protective from burnout. And then 1 minute actively sponsoring them, whether that's when you're sitting at a leadership table, talking with other people in the C-suite, or if you're talking with other people that have influence on a granting committee, 1 minute a week, sponsoring those women, they saw significant improvement in retention. And I think that's something, that culture of not just mentorship, but sponsorship, that we need to build for underrepresented, or we could say undervalued individuals in our profession. So beyond women, the people that face that intersectionality, that I think will be meaningful in helping to create that diversity at the decision-making table, and then mitigating that burnout by improving their value.
Wow, that you've thought about that. That was a very crisp response, and with a really concrete example of something that could make a difference. So I don't see any other hands up yet, so I'm going to ask you a few follow-up questions to that. The first is, you said it made a significant impact on retention. Did it actually make an impact on some of the other disparities that happen, even for those that are retained, quote unquote? Were
So
they at higher levels?
Sorry for interrupting. I'm excited about this topic, obviously.
I'm feeling that.
So they did see, they did see that there was an increase in terms of women represented at the senior management level. Unfortunately, they didn't end up publishing the data in terms of the numbers. But this is something that when you look into the gray literature, has been replicated at not so much in medicine, but more so in the business sphere across a number of different companies. So it's I would say it actually poses the question of, can we replicate this in medicine, especially if we look at something like pediatrics, where I think we have a fantastic institution here, but it's not across the board that we see female representation in leadership positions. So would implementation of a program like this be something that could help create tangible change? I don't know, maybe we should try it out.
I think that's a great idea. I think it's definitely something worth pursuing further for us. You know, and it's interesting that you brought examples from the business world, because I think we like to think that we do better in medicine than in business or law, some of the other more challenging and gender diverse fields as we see them. And you've highlighted to us that we're not a whole lot better we're not as good as we think, maybe, or as better as we think compared to those areas. And there are definitely things we can learn from, things that have been done in those areas. So I think it's a great example. There were a couple of other comments that just flew in through the chat, so I'm just going to bring them out. There's a request for a conversation about the fact that our department doesn't have a sick day compassionate care leave. We do have sick leave, but maybe that's something that we can explore further. Compassionate care is something that we don't have a compassionate care leave in specific. If it's something in the order of a few days, for sure, we do have that, but something for longer, which I think is what the question is really getting at, to care for a family member. We don't have that per se, so definitely something worth looking at further. I'm just looking at, people have written a lot. Yeah, I'm not sure if there are questions or comments, so maybe I'm going to invite anyone who's written something in to actually raise their hand and explain if they do have a question. Do you have a question now from Vanessa Bond? Go ahead, Vanessa.
Hi there. So less than a question and more just a comment. So first off, you guys did an amazing job. Congratulations. I'm really impressed with the presentation. I think, a lot of the time we have a lot of men will ask, how can I improve the situation in our workforce? And I think one thing that you can really do is show how you provide care to your own family, because, we do want to work towards a world where care is very equal, and really model that to junior learners, right? And so having male physicians say, I have to leave now because I have to pick up my kid from daycare, or I have to pick up my kids from school. I have to stop this phone call right now because I have to put dinner on the table. I think modeling that and taking paternity leave is so important, because that trickles down to the rest of the hospital and the rest of the learners to show, hey, this is normal, that as a man, I'm going to pick up my kid from daycare, I'm going to put dinner on the table. I think that's really important.
Great comments there, Vanessa. And the presenters are all nodding in agreement. That's to that.
I think I would just echo what Dr. Bond said. And I think there's an argument to be made for, if we're going to try and improve that equity, reassessing how we assess parental leave and taking potentially some of the gender connotations out of that. Because we didn't even get into discussing, what does parental leave look like if you are a non-binary couple or a non-hetero couple, and there are inherent systemic barriers to that exist based on how we define what can be considered maternal, like mat leave, pat leave versus parental leave.
Great. Well, I will invite you to read the comments on your own that have come in through the chat, all very positive. And I would also invite you to share more of your expertise with us as we look at what we can do within our department, within our immediate area of control, to really try to address this. And for sure to address the issues of burnout that affect us all. And in particular, to focus on what we can do to promote well-being amongst our faculty, male and female. So I think your expertise would be really, really helpful to us. So please stay tuned for more invitation from us. Thank you all. And thank you for a wonderful presentation and discussion. Have a great day, everyone.